Hey everyone, hope you're doing well. Video games that are limited to prototype form are fun to look at because we get to see what could have been and speculate on what the final product could have looked like. Once in a while, you don't have to speculate too much though, and that's the case here with Secret Ties for the NES, an unreleased action game by Vic Tokai. As you'll see here, the game is pretty much finished minus any possible last minute details, or it could have even been ready for mass production. It looks that close. There's no obvious missing elements to the gameplay or the story. Let's take a look at what could be considered a full NES title that just never saw the light of day. Secret Ties was based on an old manga called Master Thief Sugar by Takai Saito. He also created Golgo 13, which was also made into an NES game by the same publisher. So you can see some connections here as far as how Secret Ties came about. It was to simply be titled Master Thief Sugar in Japan, but the title was changed for Western audiences, and the title character has a different name as well. Here he's simply known as Silk instead of Sugar, which is strange. I could see some executives back then having some silly notion that Sugar wasn't a masculine enough name or something, but if you're that worried about it, then why call him Silk? It doesn't really matter though, it's just corporate nonsense. The game begins with Silk taking on a job for a guy named Vince, and there's just enough story throughout the game to propel the action without getting in the way. Before the first level, I like how the game breaks the fourth wall here. Right after that, the game begins with Silk proclaiming, "Another day, another dollar." That's so fun to me. It subverts your expectations of how a protagonist is supposed to act. James Bond certainly wouldn't say that, but that's what makes it refreshing and interesting. How many games have you played where the mighty hero tells you from the start that he's just not that into it? I love that. You see versions of this attitude in other manga and anime like Trigun or One Punch Man, and it's something I think the Japanese pull off very well in pop culture. So on to the game itself. As you can see, it has the bones of an action side-scroller, and you'll see it has a good bit of verticality thrown in too. Silk can climb walls, and the levels occasionally offer two pathways to progress. Your attacks are a punch, jump kick, and crouching kick. Pretty standard stuff, though you can also obtain a shield that makes you invincible for a couple seconds, and also ammo for a gun. We'll talk more about the shield later. As for the gun, it isn't necessary very often other than to simply make it easier to mow everyone down, and maybe for some bosses. With a few exceptions, this game isn't too difficult on its face, though the levels are decently long. This means that even though you have unlimited continues, you still have to cover a lot of ground if you have to use them. Vince betrays you after the first stage, and the race is on to save Silk's girlfriend Reiko, and some artifacts that will apparently let Vince take over the world. It's a good enough excuse to traverse the game's 6 levels, which have decent variety in their design. There are also a lot of traps and hazards that are pretty unique. Many of them are used sparingly, so it's nice that the developers were willing to build assets but not recycle the crap out of them. This variety definitely helps to hold your interest throughout the game. What's not so varied is the enemy roster. Every level has mostly the same bad guys, just redesigned visually to fit each level theme. Some punch, some shoot at you, and there are a few different robots. You'll see the same enemy behaviors from beginning to end. Sometimes they're mixed up enough that things feel somewhat fresh, but this is a bit of a letdown. The bosses are also on the mediocre side. Their attacks are pretty easy to avoid, and if you're not sure you'll survive, just break out the gun and unload on them. I guess if the devs are choosing good level design over having lots of different enemies, that's not a terrible decision, but it'd be nice to have both. The control feels very good, and once I got used to Silk's slightly odd animations, I found everything to be incredibly responsive. However, his attacks look like they have enough range, but they also seem to have a weird sweet spot. Half the hits I've taken in this game were after missed punches that must have been a millimeter away from the other guy's face. And it seems that if you're too close to an enemy, they'll damage you, but you won't damage them. This is more of a quirk than a criticism, but it made the game a little harder than it should have been at times. Even though the game control's great, and even when you've memorized everything, it's still hard to not take a lot of hits. I think the music here is above average, especially if you're counting the cutscenes and title screen. The level 1 track is very curious though. I'd say that's a good ripoff of Bloody Tears from Castlevania 2, but a ripoff nonetheless. The sound effects are a little lacking in general, as if some of them are downplayed or not there at all, but I didn't find it to be a big deal. They could be better is all, and if they were going to put some final polish on the game, I suspect this might be one area. I mentioned the difficulty before, and again, it's on the easier side, but I have to mention one thing. There were a few screens in the game, not entire levels, just screens, that drove me absolutely insane trying to get past them. The game didn't give me a ton of trouble otherwise, but I've got to get these off my chest, so let me describe them for you. Here we see a huge spike pit that you obviously can't jump across. You need the shield, which will allow you to briefly touch the spikes and climb up safely. But for some reason the shield is almost nowhere to be found in this game. You need to get it from this mummy guy earlier in the level who drops a random power-up. Problem is, he almost never drops the shield. You can exit the screen and come back to kill him again and get a new power-up, which is annoying, but at least it can be done. Just don't grab the power-up before leaving and he'll respawn next time. It's still an issue though because he's dropped a shield for me I think twice out of 20 or 30 tries. It's a total shot in the dark and the game ground to a halt for me at this point. Here's what's crazier though. You actually don't have to do any of this. I figured I'd search the internet to see if anyone else had this issue trying to get the shield. I figured it was a bug that hadn't been worked out, or maybe the spike pit was too big and never fixed, effectively ending the game in this unfinished state. Turns out, you don't even need the shield, but the solution is pretty cryptic. All you have to do is stand on the platform by the spike pit and do a slide move, which is down and jump. This will shoot you through the floor and out the other side, avoiding the pit entirely. My question is, why? You'd have to be pretty bored and a little illogical to even try this, because presumably you'll just slide into the pit and die. Plus, it doesn't make any sense. How is Silk basically teleporting through the structure of some old temple? It's pretty stupid, and frankly I didn't feel bad for not figuring it out. Why not just make the shield more available? It's right there in the menu and the player knows it exists to find and use. But I digress. The other two parts that frustrated me were this climbing wall that has one too many enemies on it, and these revolving platforms. For the wall, you have to do a stop-start maneuver to avoid everything and not fall, but even still I can't get it to work all the time. I've lost countless lives to this one simple obstacle. The revolving platforms are hell because they seem to rotate on not one but two patterns. That doesn't sound like a big deal, but try keeping all that straight in your head while planning your jump and trying to get to the other side. It's maddening. You also can't move through the platforms, so if one is in the way, it's just another hazard that kills you. These should have used one pattern, or the spikes below should have been removed. These three measly sections almost ruined the game for me, and they would have if not for modern technology. I'll admit it, I save-scummed the shit out of the wall and platform sections. They make the difficulty so uneven, even if it's brief. It's brutal having to continue and go through the whole level again, only to die at the same couple of obstacles. Those parts really should have been brainstormed one more time before the game was declared finished. Now look, I know I'm mostly focused on the negative here, but that's only because those are the more interesting parts of the game. In the end, I actually like this game overall, and wouldn't talk anyone out of playing it. Most aspects of the game are good, they're just merely capable as opposed to something more impressive. Back in 1991, I think Secret Ties would have been described as a great rental. If you needed a decent game to occupy yourself for a weekend, this would fit the bill. I wouldn't put it in the same stratosphere as the best NES games, but it definitely belongs in the pile of games that are actually worth revisiting and putting time into. There are many games that are better left in the past, but this is not one of them. So why wasn't the game released when it was so close to being finished? Well, any NES game released in the early 90s had to contend with the simple fact that the Super Nintendo had become what every kid wanted. By that point, if your new NES game wasn't expected to sell a ton of units, then it would be smart to sit down and figure out if it was even worth releasing, even in a finished state. Remember, digital distribution was decades away. It was either spend all the time and money required to box and ship the game all over the world, or simply cut your losses. A more limited release would be an option, but what's the point really? Look at Golgo 13. It was a niche game, so another game with similar roots released so late wouldn't have had much potential for success. Also, Master Thief Sugar seems like an incredibly obscure property then and now. I can barely find any mention of it online, if you can believe that, so how many Westerners would have cared or even known about it before the internet? This game wasn't even released for the Famicom in Japan, so suffice to say, it's a game nobody really asked for. Thankfully, it's a decent time if you have the means to play it. Secretize still would have been a niche game even on a good day, but it's perfectly capable, and believe me, that's worth a lot when you're rummaging through random old video games. If you're running out of worthwhile NES games to play, it's worth taking for a spin. Well, hope you enjoyed this, and by all means let me know in the comments what other games you'd like me to cover, obscure or not. Let me know what you think of this video too. Thanks as always, and I'll see you next time.